Well, exit polls suggest the Labour Party is set to win the most seats by any party since 2001. The Conservatives, on the other hand, the fewest seats since the party was founded in 1834. Here to discuss more about the UK election is Simon Usherwood. He's a professor of politics and international studies at the Open University and joining us tonight from Guildford, England. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Pleasure to be here.
First off, what's your reaction to this exit polling, and also how massive of a shift is this?
I think it's a really important moment in British politics. You're seeing for only the fourth time a Labour leader being elected to office by the public, and with a huge majority, as you were saying, comparable to when Tony Blair took office in 1997. So I think in terms of changing the politics of the UK, a really important moment. But I think the thing that's still unclear is quite what Labour is going to do with that power that it has and that huge majority it's likely to get tomorrow morning.
Well, let's talk about Labour in a moment, but first let's talk about the Conservatives, because they have been in power for the past 14 years now. What factors do you think led up to what looks like, at least, a historic loss?
Well, I think you've already touched on the main one, which is that 14 years in power is a long time for any party, no matter how good they might be. And I think that a large part of the voting behaviour we've seen has been driven by dissatisfaction with the Tories, particularly over the last few years following Partygate, the Liz Truss mini-budget, 2 years ago. All of those things have really undermined the core competencies of the Conservatives around economic management, around kind of sensible, kind of pragmatic politics. So I think this is as much about a failure of their seemingly natural position in power. And I think what's going to be really interesting is now what happens next. The exit polls that we've had suggest that Reform UK are going to win potentially a significant number of seats. There'll be a presence in the House of Commons, and they're going to be putting pressure on that rump of the Conservative Party to move further to the right in the way that we've seen in other countries. So I think there's going to be a really interesting tussle out on the right of Parliament in the coming 5 years.
So why do you think, if that is the feeling right now in the UK, why did Rishi Sunak call this snap election?
Well, this is the question that has been bothering a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues for the last couple of months, because nobody's come up with a good answer. I think probably the best argument that anyone's come up with is that there was a small run of good economic news containing inflation, some economic growth, but really still not much confidence in the picture that was there. He had until the end of this year to call the election, and perhaps he just decided that there was no great benefit in dragging it out, and certainly it's hard to see what he could have pulled out of the bag in the next 6 months. So at some level, you have to admire him for being willing to bring his job to an end that bit sooner. But in terms of practical politics, it doesn't look like a well thought out move, particularly as the campaign hasn't really caught anyone's great attention, hasn't really set the world on fire. So all in all, it looks like another misstep from Rishi Sunak.
On this side of the pond, the economy, cost of living, huge issues right now. What were the ballot box issues in this election? And why do you think Labour was able to communicate their policy objectives on that so effectively?
Well, as in Canada, it's the same. It's the economy, it's the state of economic well-being, the state of public services as well, particular concern around the health service and social care. To some extent, also some issues around immigration, particularly for Conservative voters. And I think what will be interesting is whether Labour wants to maintain its relatively tough language once it gets into power, now that it has that huge cushion. So I think what Labour offered really was competence as much as anything. If you look at their manifesto promises, really very modest, a lot of talk about how the public finances aren't great. So there's not going to be turning on the spending taps and drowning everyone in new funds. Instead, this is about sort of prudence, sensible, quite boring politics. And perhaps that's what we need in the UK after what's been quite a hectic decade, let's say.
It certainly has been. It's been a little bit difficult to keep up with who is Prime Minister today. But tell me about the leader of the Labour Party and give us a sense of who he is and who the possible incoming Prime Minister will be once all of the votes are counted.
Well, Keir Starmer, in one interview in the campaign, was accused of being a bit dull and a bit boring, and he took it as a compliment. And I think that probably tells you all you need to know. He's not a Tony Blair kind of figure. His politics are not dissimilar, but he's not a man with great visions of leadership and throwing himself around. I think he's very determined. He's got a big track record in public service over the last couple of decades. He's done a really competent job of modernising the Labour Party, addressing issues around anti-Semitism, and really just, kind of very managerial kind of politics. So I think in that sense, it's probably the politician that the government, that the public wants at this stage, a safe pair of hands. Who's going to get them through what are going to be some difficult times, because the economy remains a difficult issue. The international system's going to be quite difficult. And, we'll see next week in Washington at the NATO summit quite how he looks on the international stage.
The UK stands out as one of the few countries turning left this time. With the anticipated victory of the Labour Party, most other countries, including France, are leaning toward the right. What are your thoughts on the UK going in a different direction?
Well, I think to some extent the UK has always been more right in terms of European politics than its neighbouring countries. So perhaps we were ahead of that particular curve. And remember, we've had a Conservative government or a Conservative-led government since 2010. So a long period in which the right has held the upper hand. And what's interesting this time is if these exit polls are correct, then seeing Reform UK come through, breaking through with a more populist, a more radical right kind of message, I think that will add a new dynamic to the system. And, that'll be the first time that you've really had that kind of representation. So as much as the Conservatives have taken a real drubbing now, it's not necessarily because of huge enthusiasm for Labour. And I think that's going to be Keir Starmer's challenge in the coming weeks and months, is to show voters and show the public that actually this is a government that does have some ideas, that does have an agenda and is making a difference. Because I think if it can't deliver on that, we might well find ourselves in another period of electoral volatility. And I think that's been the big message, is that voters are very quick to shift their allegiances, and this could all change all over again very soon.
Well, we will watch and see. Simon, appreciate your analysis here tonight.
Thank you very much.
That is Simon Usherwood, Professor of Politics and International Studies at the Open University, joining us tonight from Guildford, England.